and how people in repressed societies, countries use it as a medium to express their frustration and criticism. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, and let me introduce our moderator, who will introduce the speakers later, Lizelle Hinz. Thank you so much. She kindly agreed to moderate today's discussion, and she has been working on this very topic herself for some time. So she's the perfect person to moderate this panel. Lizelle is an assistant professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. She received her PhD from George Washington University and held teaching positions at Cornell University and Barnard College at Columbia University. So please join me in welcoming Lizelle, and then she'll introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the organizers of this. As someone who's been in DC for 2.5 years, working on Turkey, given the tumult in US-Turkey relations and change in domestic politics in Turkey, I've been on a lot of panels, but I can say with an exact degree of certitude, this is the coolest panel that I have ever been on. So I want everyone to thank Gunu for having the idea to organize this. So if we could just join us, please. Thank you so much for organizing this. This means an immense amount to me. I am just finishing up teaching a course on the intersection of politics and pop culture in Turkey over at SAIS. I'm working on a book manuscript on the intersection of politics and pop culture. And it's just, I think, an understudied, underexplored intersection. So I really respect that Middle East Institute and the other organizers decided to hold this panel. As a testament to the importance of this intersection, Middle East Institute, for example, has an art display that opens on Friday, which is Speaking Across Mountains. It's an intersection or a dialogue among Kurdish artists. So I encourage you to check that out. But I think it's important to recognize this commitment to looking not just at politics as, diplomats and politics as politicians, but politics from societal perspectives, and understanding the frustrations and the desires and the voices that can be amplified when we look at politics through the lens of music and film and art and these other vernacular fora. So this is a really, really exciting panel for me. I'll briefly introduce my co-panelists. I am giddy to introduce Sarp Palaur, also known as Shanashar, who is the mastermind behind the video Susamam that you saw. He was the inspiration, he and his team, his collaborative team, were the inspiration for a Washington Post monkey cage piece that I wrote on how Turkish rap videos are sort of galvanizing an opposition that hasn't had a lot of other channels to express its frustration in Turkey. So I am incredibly thankful for you to be here. He's a director, he's a composer, he's a rap artist. He's put out a number of albums, and I think is actually releasing soon a collaborative piece with Sezen Aksu next week, right? So like high caliber, right? Pretty impressive.
Thank you.
So we're incredibly lucky to have you with us. In the middle, we have Kenan Behzat Sharp, who recently received his PhD from University of California, Santa Cruz. He is an absolute expert on all things Turkey music related. He also works on social movements, intersection with film and music and so forth. So I'm really, really pleased to have him. He's also working as a journalist. You can read his stuff in Al Monitor and Jacobin and other outlets. And then we're incredibly lucky and honored to have Ayşe Öncü, Professor Dr. Ayşe Öncü, who is Professor Emeritus of Sociology. She was one of the founding members of the Sociology Department at Boğaziçi. She later moved to Sabancı University, where she was the first woman to receive the title of emeritus. She's worked extensively on culture, on city spaces, on Istanbul. So we're really lucky to have this incredibly talented set of guests here today. thinking about, we're going to start with music, but if we're thinking about the intersection of politics and pop culture in Turkey, we can think of so many different genres in which the government is exercising its control, is engaging in forms of censorship. Artists feel as though they have to engage in forms of self-censorship. We can think of Zehra Doğan, the Kurdish artist and journalist, actually whose work will be featured at the Middle East Institute's art exhibition, who has been jailed for her work, but nevertheless finds a way to continue to create art in her jail cell by actually painting the bodies of prisoners who are soon to be released. So she's getting her art out into the world in a relatively subversive and frankly very creative way. We can think of someone like Kazım Öz, a Kurdish filmmaker, director, who in fact had received some government support for some of his work when the solution process, the peace process was going on between the government and the Kurds, and later was indicted on charges of being a member of a terrorist organization and is facing up to 15 years in jail for that. So it just kind of shows the fickleness of the intersection of politics and pop culture there. You know, one of the things that really drew me to this discussion of how can art, how can pop culture, even something like a dizzy, like a soap opera television series, right? How can it address politics? Well, I was watching, I'm going to tell this anecdote because it's the inspiration for what I'm working on right now, but I was watching television in March of 2014, and I was watching a show whose name I won't give, but I saw the protagonist get out of his car, escort a small boy carrying a loaf of bread off the road, and say, "My lion, my son, you need to be careful where you're walking. These are dangerous times and dangerous places." And this was a week after Berkin Elvan had died. And Berkin Elvan, of course, was the 14-year-old who had gone out to buy bread during the Gezi Park protests, was hit in the head with a tear gas canister, lingered for a number of months in a coma before finally dying. So the fact that, and I was like, did I make that up? Is there a connection? And then you go on Twitter and you see that everyone's talking about the fact that commentary on the frustrations of the violence that's being used against society is being inserted into a night of entertainment that you wouldn't otherwise necessarily recognize. So these little hidden moments can be used to kind of express frustration against the government. And actually, one of the really fascinating things about studying Turkish television is, well, the series are really long, but they're usually released about a week or so after they're made, so they can respond to events. So you can actually watch Turkish television shows responding to political events. So this idea of how culture, what we think of as entertainment and art can be used to express frustrations is how I have gotten where I am and why I was so moved when I woke up on Friday morning in early September and saw that Susamam had gone viral. So we're going to talk a little bit about that process. If you haven't watched the video, it's about a 15-minute epic. It's called like the Magnum Opus of Turkish music. People have referred to it in many ways. It's 17 different artists some duos who've come together to discuss everything from environmental destruction to violence against women. We'll talk about that specifically. I think that was one of the most poignant scenes in it, to animal rights, something of particular interest to Sarp, to education and how individuals who are supposed to be prepared for the world aren't able to get the jobs that they want. So it's really a societal commentary in an incredible and very creative form. So we have the opportunity here to speak with the mastermind behind this, the artist who put this together. So Sarp, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how the project came together. What was your inspiration? How did you contact all of these artists? Were they all really enthusiastic about the project? Can you just tell us a little bit about how, what has become known as the Magnum Opus of Turkish rap and opposition? How did it come together?
Well, I'm making conscious rap music, political rap music for over 10 years now. But last year, rap music finally got popular in Turkey. And after that, I observed that collaboration songs of big amount of people gets millions of views and really big attention. But the collab songs that I see, and some of them I attend to, was empty, was talking about nothing. It was just rapping. So I said, I can make one for myself, but this time we can use this power to reach people for something good. So I started reaching to my inner circle, my best friends first, and then I reached some of the good rappers that I want to rap with, and finally I decided to take the project to the rappers who are known for not feeling the same way about me, about the world, you know, from different political views and from different ideologies, because I wanted to make a unifying song. So, of course, some turned me down,
Yeah.
which was understandable. And the others who attended to the song were very happy and excited to make this project.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
It is, I think, worth noting that while we're talking about this as a very sort of political gesture or political statement, that there's nothing specific about the government that is said. There's nothing specific.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's not partisan in that sense. It's more societal problems that the government should be paying attention to.
Yeah.
So I think it makes a lot of sense that you were reaching out to people from different political views to present this sort of overall critique.
Yeah, sure. Also, the song is not only about Turkey.
Yeah.
The problems are worldwide, you know. So we were not meant to make a political song and criticize the government. We were just writing the issues that we face, every one of us face in our society, and also most of them are worldwide problems.
Yeah, so you talk about drought, for example. You talk about you know, people who are living away from their homeland and what that's like.
Yeah.
So I think there's a universalizing human aspect to this that really resonated, even with individuals who don't know a lot about Turkey. So I was watching this go viral and seeing who was sharing it, and there were many citizens of Turkey who living abroad and within Turkey that were very excited about it, but also people who not really paid attention or known a lot about what was happening in Turkey. I think the fact that so many of these issues are universal, affecting so many different societies, really gave this a lot of gravitas, quite a lot of power to it. So one of the questions that everybody wants to know is, this dropped at the exact same time as SL's Olay, right?
Yeah.
Event, incident. And that one is very overtly political and contains images of the AKP, it contains images of Donald Trump, it contains images of a lot of figures, and that's quite overtly political. Was this coordinated at all?
No,
Okay.
it was just a coincidence, but
Okay.
it served well, I guess,
It
right?
did.
Nah.
So everybody's kind of speculating these two rap videos, and of course then they're comparing them to each other, right? And finding, okay, well, this one's more political, this one's sort of more epic and so forth. But I think even if it was, you know, or the fact that it was a coincidence really helped draw an immense amount of international attention to it.
Sure.
And I think one of the things that pop culture can do is serve as a megaphone for grievances and to help people have empathy. And kind of sympathize.
Yeah, actually, as a rapper, the two songs coming out together was a happy thing for me, because we showed in Turkey, rap is really new and rappers are really new, so they don't know anything about hip-hop culture. They are the first rappers they see. This was the first time, let's say, political pieces come out together and make a hit. So it was good to people to show that rappers are not only interested in money and women and gang and so on, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it was important for me to happen in Turkey to show people rappers can be conscious and rappers can be good people, you know, decent people.
Absolutely. So I want to get back to some of the details of this, but Kenan, I want to move to you and kind of, if you can give us some perspective on rap in Turkey. And is this a new genre? Is it evolving? Sort of what are the dynamics? What are some other forms of music that have been used as platforms of criticism and so forth?
Yeah. So rap has a longer history in Turkey than we'd expect, I think. So what's interesting about rap in Turkey is that is my voice too loud? Is this good? It really began among Turkish people living in Germany, is where rap first, for Turkish language rap, we could say, first began. And the first experiments in Turkish language rap began in Berlin, mostly in sort of immigrant districts like Kreuzberg, Around 1991, 1992 is when you have the first songs beginning. But when it really grew large and started to affect Turkey itself was in 1995 with the appearance of a group called Kartel, which is a large group with many members. And Kartel was a really interesting group because they were coming out of a context in Germany where in the 1990s there was a lot of racist sort of anti-immigrant incidents. And there was a famous arson that happened in 1993. A group of neo-Nazis lit a building on fire where a large Turkish family lived. So Kartel came up and they sort of had this pride about, listen, we're Turks, we've been here working, we need to be recognized, we need to be respected. And also interesting about the group is that they're not only Turks and sort of putting forward that Turkish identity, they were also sort of putting forward a concept of Germany that was more multiracial and welcoming immigrants. So there was an Afro-Cuban guy in the band, there was a white German, and they sang not only in Turkish but also in German and Spanish. So they went on tour after releasing their album in 1995, a self-titled album called Kartel. They went to tour in Turkey, and they really created waves. That year I read, the Kartel album sold more copies than Michael Jackson did in Turkey, so more than 1 million. So a pretty astounding thing. And then from there, rap really developed, and it's kind of gone through different periods of being more overground or sort of visible, and periods of still being really prolific and interesting, but a little bit more in sort of subcultures. So there's been many, we could say we're now in the sort of 4th or even 5th generation of rappers in Turkey. It continued in the 90s with Kartel, and other groups came up. In the 2000s, some of the most dominant voices were first a group called Nefret, and then Ceza continued to do his own stuff. A rapper like Sagopa Kajmer began releasing music in a kind of more interesting, introspective style. Cholera, all sorts of more people than I can name, continuing into our own decade now. And it goes through periods where I think in the 2000s there were moments when you could say it was mainstream again. Certain rappers were invited on television to perform, and there were also really kind of high-profile cases of disses or sort of insults that were going between rappers. But now rap is having another moment of being sort of in the limelight, and it's always been political, and I can get into why that is exactly with rap perhaps later, but we're really having a sort of renaissance now where a video like Susamam and also artists like Hazel, who are bringing what is now for the last decade, the most current style in rap, which is called trap, which makes sort of liberal use of auto-toned vocals and a kind of more down-tempo, slower pace, which allows the rappers to also rap more quickly. This has really come into Turkey as well. So you really see an interesting thing happening, and especially Susamam was an intriguing case because there's always been hardcore fans of rap, and there's been this kind of core scene that sometimes comes to the surface, sometimes goes back down. But what was interesting about that project is that it really, like you said, it allowed people who aren't normally interested in rap or have written it off as being a kind of empty genre to actually take notice and say these rappers have a message, they're saying something, and it's something we need to listen to. And should I also talk about larger? You asked about other traditions of music.
Yeah, let's keep it to rap for now,
Absolutely.
but we can move on to like arabesque, and I know you're writing a book on Anadolu rock, so I think that's absolutely fascinating. So one of the things that we see among a lot of rap artists is collaboration, right? So we talked about the duet that's coming out with Sezen Aksu, of collaboration across different genres as a way of reaching out to lots of different audiences. And we see this within Susamam as well. And within the entire collaborative project, there's one woman, Deniz Tekin, who sings in almost this like ethereal, like ruhani, like really angelic tone, but she's saying things like, I was never murdered, I never had to be afraid of my brother, I was never burned alive, right? And it's horrifying in a sense. So can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to include that message and what was kind of the inspiration behind that and how that came together?
Well, worldwide, in America, as we see from Turkey, the women rights activism is going really good, like Me Too movement and so on, but in Turkey it's not the case. I'm not even talking about sexual harassment crimes, I'm talking about killings, the murders. Every 3 days, 2 women gets murdered by men. So if I was planning to make a song which will address issues, of course the women rights should be a part of it. And of course I wanted it to be performed by a woman artist. But unfortunately, I don't know any good Turkish woman rappers. There are not so many female rappers in Turkey, but Deniz is a great friend of mine, and she's a brilliant folk artist and folk songwriter, so I asked her to do it, and then we wrote and we recorded. Then when I listened, I felt really sad, and the voice was so fragile. So but the sadness is not the only feeling that I want the audience to feel when they listen. So I want them to understand our anger too. So I contacted my other rapper friends and told them to write another verse which will be more angry and more punctual to show the men's perspective of these stupid crimes. And that's how it turned out.
Yeah. It was such a powerful, and I was watching the commentary of a lot of people who were focusing on this, and that particular segment resonated a lot. And I think the timing of it had a lot to do with it. So Emine Bulut had recently been killed by her ex-husband on video in a cafe. People are wondering how this is possible. There was just an accumulation of murders of women and of trials that have not gotten the justice that women are looking for. It's, I think, 390 women have been murdered by their partners in Turkey this year alone. And yesterday we saw that for Shulecet, for example, we had a decision with hefty sentences being given to her murderers, but initially this was looked at as a suicide, and we see this in a lot of cases where the crime is written off as suicide or accident or something along those lines, or domestic dispute. But I think even incorporating. So I know in Olay, for example, Emine Bulut's name comes across the screen along with the numbers of women each year who are killed. So again, that coincidence that both of your videos came out at the same time and that there was such a strong focus on women's rights, I think was really important. So it's, and we have these campaigns in Turkey, protests on the day of, efforts to end violence against women, and they're met with police force, right? So I think it's important that you point out that we see some sort of progress in movements in other places, but while there are very strong efforts in Turkey, they're being met with a lot of resistance. So this video is, this collaborative effort is a way to give voice to those women that don't otherwise necessarily get to give their voice out. So I takti ediyorum. It was really, I give it a lot of respect. It was, I think, very important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Kenan, I want to return to you on the rap question and other music, and then I want to move to Aisha Hoja to hear more about other genres and kind of the political economy of entertainment and media as well, in terms of what space is there for expression, what censorship exists, what perhaps hope may exist or not. So Kenan, for me it seems like rap is a particularly useful genre for expressing rage, for expressing grief. I've gotten used to writing about the use of humor in pop culture, in Gezi and so forth, but here you have unbelievable rage and grief and frustration expressed in different ways by different artists, as Sarp was saying. How do you see different music genres in Turkey also being forums for opposition or for expressing dissent?
Yeah, you could say that there's several genres that have been used to express dissent in Turkey. The kind of substrate of many of them is folk, and I think this is one place where, in some ways, rap a little bit separates off. But if we're talking about music and dissent in what is today Turkey, you can really go back quite far to sort of Ottoman times or even before, to medieval ozan or aşık, these sort of wandering minstrel-type figures who would sometimes sing songs more mystical, kind of it sort of goes between oral poetry and music together, often performed with bağlama or another stringed instrument. So you have figures like in the 15th to 16th century, Pir Sultan Abdal, who was an Alevi figure, who basically was writing protest songs in that period and faced state repression for it. And moving on to the 20th century, folk continues to be a really crucial place for the expression of grievances. So in the 20th century, we have a figure like Aşık Mahzuni Şerif, who was from a poor villager from Maraş, who in the 60s, like a lot of people, intellectuals at the time, got sort of swept up in the socialist movement. And he was a member of TIP, the Turkish Labor Party, and was writing really strongly oppositional songs. There's this great anecdote from Cahit Berkay from Moğollar, the band Moğollar, who said that he saw Aşık Mahzuni playing a show for some sort of socialist youth organization in the 60s, and he's there on stage with his bağlama singing a song called Katil America, America the Murderer. And Cahit Berkay said it felt like it was the first Turkish rocker, this one guy just up on stage riling up the crowd. And he and other folk figures had a really big influence on rock developing, or specifically, like we mentioned, Anadolu rock, this genre of rock and roll that combined Turkish folk influences and local instruments like the zurna and other things like that. So actual songs by folk singers like Mahzuni were transformed into protest rock songs, played with electric guitar. So people like Selda Bağcan and Edip Akbayram and others would perform songs by Mahzuni and other people like that. And then also, interestingly, even in terms of talking about slightly more mainstream pop, there's been a long history of sort of oppositional themes coming into music. So in the 60s, one of the first really rock songs in Turkey was a song called Fabrika Kızı, or the Factory Girl by Alpay, talking about a working class girl and her sort of existence between home and factory, etc. There's a performer then, Ayla Algan, who had a song called Koca Öküz, or the old, not cow, what is it?
Bull?
Bull. The old bull, kind of talking about the problems of villagers and rural women in specific trying to survive in a male-dominated society and also in the midst of poverty. Even more mainstream figures like Ajda Pekkan had a song for the 1980 Eurovision concert called Aman Petrol, talking about the price of gas and all these other sort of social issues. And that continues on. Sezen Aksu, who we mentioned, has many political songs about victims of the 1980 military coup in Turkey, about the Saturday mothers who gather to try to find justice for their relatives who have been killed in the conflict in the southeast. And then today, rock continues. We saw, of course, a really interesting outpouring of oppositional music during the Gezi Park protests of 2013, where the rock band Duman, for example, performed a really interesting song directly responding to the events as they were happening. A group, Kardeş Türküler, who sing songs in Kurdish and other languages, also put out a song in that period. The classical pianist Fazıl Say also was supportive in a certain capacity. So music continues to be that, and now rap has always been political in Turkey, but is sort of taking the mantle as the dominant form.
Excellent. Aisha Hoca, I want to turn to you and kind of think of some other genres in which we've seen art serve as a platform for dissent. You've written a lot on political satire magazines. Obviously, we can think of film, other genres.
I'm listening along with you with fascination to this discussion of the art field, of music. Now, I'd like to make two broader points, if you will allow me.
Of
One of them is the relative, what might call, autonomization of the art field from the state since the 1990s. I consider this quite important. So the art field itself is very heterogeneous, obviously. There's what I would call corporate sector. I want to say a few words about the corporate sector in the art field in Turkey. I want to say independent initiatives, and also what is often referred to as the subaltern field, if you will. But I'd also like to say a few words about what difference the new municipality might make in the art field. I think that's important, and I think there's some hope in that. So about the art field and its autonomization in general, I mean, we've always been, as Turkish academics, critical of the tentacular, gigantic corporations in Turkey. But since the 1990s, these corporations have been investing quite heavily in the art field, mainly as a way of building cultural capital, as a way of public relations. So this is not a philanthropic business altogether. But also, they all have invested in universities, in museums, in music. For instance, Borusan has the only private symphony orchestra in Turkey. and certainly a lot in broader art, conventional art, what might be called. But this is so in Japan. Japanese corporations have been doing the same thing, American corporations, so this is not specific to Turkish corporations. The very fact that there was a huge corporate sector in the Turkish economy has meant that throughout the 1990s, they have shifted their emphasis to art as a form of, as I said, global stature. This has meant, of course, that this sector has become relatively autonomous from the state. It is also, of course, reliant on the state in some ways, reliant on public, what might be called public-private collaborations, particularly in allocations of space in such a city as Istanbul. It's impossible nowadays to build a museum in Istanbul apart from directly getting permission from Erdogan. So this is, this is not, but this is not in financial terms. The centralized Ministry of Culture and Tourism heavily invests in what it calls heritage projects, which is essentially Islamic heritage projects. This has been so, I worked on one of the alternative culture policy documents for the EU, and this has been the pattern for almost 5 years now. All the mosques, all the türbes, all the fountains in Turkey have received facelifts, criticized by restorers, but they have all received facelifts. But apart from this, the Ministry of Culture also has a film fund, but independent filmmakers do not like to apply to this fund because it also brings along with it censorship. So what I'm trying to say is that although in some ways large corporations have become incorporated into the clientelistic networks of AKP. They have become incorporated and have become involved in crony networks. This is inevitable in Turkey at the moment, economically, given the level of centralization introduced by AK Party. But even so, in the art field, they have remained fairly autonomous, and I would consider this sector as a bulwark against further Islamization in the art field, frankly. I know I'm exaggerating, but I do think that this is important, and corporations have continued to invest in art and in the art field in general. So I really think that a new municipality in Istanbul will make a difference, but not that much in this sector. I think it will make a big difference in what we have come to refer as the bağımsız inisiyatifler sektörü, independent initiatives. Tell me if I've talked too much. But these independent initiatives are highly varied. They are, again, a product of the past 10 years or so. Especially, they have been energized by Gezi events. Yeah. And they are highly heterogeneous, so I could give numerous examples. And they are also define themselves as political. The meaning of what constitutes political in Turkey is among these initiatives is obviously subject to much dispute. But on the ground, it often means opening up the realm of Republican nationalist narratives to accounts of political violence, to accounts of dispossession. Yeah. On the field, this means opening up questions of Armenian massacres, opening questions of Kurdish insurgency, and most of all, violence against women. Yeah. So these independent initiatives are, I think, a crucial domain. One point I'd like to mention and hopefully ask some of the German representatives here is that in these circles, dependence is not on the corporate sector. They are not independent. In fact, they pride themselves of being independent of the commercialized corporate sector and commodified corporate sector. They are also pride themselves in being independent of the state, but they have transnational connections that are very wide, and the German corporations, particularly the German Vakıflar, such as the Heinrich Böll Foundation, Mercator Foundation, Friedrich Ebert Foundation, whose representative we heard, have been very supportive of this particular domain, field, sphere of cultural production. And it's been very important in recent years. There's much to be studied about this sphere in general, but relations with Europe makes a great difference in the vibrancy of this sector. It's now, one of the dangers here that is being talked about is that these foundations may withdraw from Turkey, from the art field in Turkey. One reason, obviously, is the unpredictability of Erdogan himself coming up with a new idea on television, seemingly every day, such as introducing religion lessons in kindergarten. All of these foundations have museums, all of which have children's programs of various sorts. Enormous number of children's programs trying to counteract central government policies. But if now the possible withdrawal of these foundations from investments or support in Turkey is also linked to the rise of the nationalist governments, nationalist movements in Europe. For instance, in Germany, this was not mentioned earlier, but in Germany, AfD, the rise of into a third-party position, means that many of the boards of European foundations now include also party representatives who want German support to arts and independent initiatives to be channeled to German initiatives. So this Germany's support of multiculturalism seems... Okay, I'll stop here.
No, you're good. The political economy story that you're telling, I think, is so incredibly important, irrespective of what genre that we're talking about. From a temporal standpoint, in terms of the privatization of media in the 90s, that kind of opens up a space for different voices in television, different voices on the radio, different languages eventually. But then kind of the consolidation under the AKP era. And I'm actually quite encouraged by the point about autonomy that you make, because I think, particularly when we talk about when we talk about news media, we talk about these holding groups that control 90 to 95% of the media because they own newspapers and television stations and construction companies and have banking interests and financial interests and so forth. So the fact that there is some autonomy for art is, I think, quite encouraging. And then you add the transnational dimension to it. But I feel as though even if there is political or financial autonomy, we see elements of societal backlash. So if there's an art gallery opening and there's people drinking alcohol in the streets, then they might get attacked, right? So there's a societal or almost like neighborhood pushback against some of those efforts as well. So I'm very encouraged by the point that you make about autonomy, but I wonder if there hasn't been almost like a society is deputizing itself to push back against some of these efforts. So I think that was a fantastic contribution. I want to ask a question of each of you, the same question, and then I will actually turn it over to the audience because we have time for questions, and I'm sure you guys are brimming with questions. And it's a broad question, and you can answer it however you like, but in the opening to Susamam, before you get into the different verses, there's this voice that says, life's really tough and you want music to entertain you. You kind of want it to take you away from reality. That gets to this idea that music is just kind of about entertainment, or pop culture is entertainment. It's like the circus in Bread and Circus, right? Like, people will be distracted if you give them entertainment. But then the point is made that, but we actually believe that music can change things, that we have the power to change things. So what I'd like to know from each of you, and it could be music, it could be different forms of art, however you'd like to focus on, to what extent do you believe that art has the power to actually change things? Have we seen examples of this where art has actually made a difference, has changed politics? Should we keep up this optimistic spirit that Aisha Hoja brought to us? Sarp, can I start with you?
Well, that's what I want to believe.
Yeah.
But looking at realistically, I don't think that music can literally change some big things. About my music, I'm talking about my music, but that's what I hope. That's what I hope. That's what I want to believe in. When I was 15 or 16, I was listening Hispanic American rappers that time, and they moved me. They really amazed me, and that's how I realized that I want to make music and try to change things. So their music didn't change the world, but it changed me. Yeah. So my goal is to change someone else. That's all. And all the big changes starts with one person. So my goal is to change only one of you. That's all.
Well, you've changed me. No, I think this is so important, especially in political science. I think we, or even just analysis of politics in general, we tend to think of change as like regime change, right? Or policy change. And that's why I think focusing on pop culture is so important, because societal changes, even at the individual level, can make a difference. So I think that was a fantastic way to phrase it. Thank you. Kenan, what do you think? Can change be affected through art?
I think art is both absolutely crucial, and it can have a really important effect the way Sarp is describing, kind of incremental changes in attitude, perspective, also giving I think the more Turkish society gets closed down in spaces of opposition, sort of wither, the more important culture's role is for being a kind of holdout. And with your comments, Aisha Hoja, about these different realms, I think one thing about music that allows it to be this kind of space is it doesn't require the same kind of capital that something like making a film does, or having an art space. It really is, the record, you don't have big holding companies, producing the rap albums or releasing this kind of stuff. A lot of it is smaller labels run by people. So I think part of the money required makes it possible to have a more open space. But I think another way to answer your question is about whether art has an effect, is the government certainly seems to think it does. Otherwise, why would it go to such lengths to repress things? So even with Susamam, for example, all the major pro-government dailies issued all sorts of condemnatory comments about how these people are terrorists and they're pro the Fethullah Gülen movement, et cetera, et cetera. There was all sorts of pressure to sort of recant or step back.
Foreign conspiracies with the CIA, Mossad,
exactly.
Right? They don't have that kind of talent.
And then even, one of the other big cases this year was the other rapper who released a video that day, Azhal, being arrested for promoting drug use among the youth. Now, this is a really interesting thing, and there's actually, I noticed there's a human rights organization at Marmara University in Istanbul. They just had a recent conference, which I'd love to see a video of, about promoting drug use as being this kind of new stage in censorship, a new sort of technique to deal, especially with things like rap music. But there was this wonderful comment when the news broke about Azhal being arrested. It was a little bit less than a year ago, I think now, where a wonderful music critic, Derya Bengi, posted on Twitter, he showed an image from one of Azhal's early music videos where someone is holding up one of those kind of like, soccer scarves they have in Turkey with the images of the people who were killed during Gezi, the martyrs, so to speak. And Derya Bengi wrote there, "This is the moment in the song that promoted drug use." Kind of wink, wink. It's actually something much more than that, though it becomes a sort of tool that can be webbed. So, I think we have to be a little bit skeptical of using the government itself as a barometer for whether something is effective, because I think once a government goes down a certain sort of autocratic route, it becomes more and more paranoid about what is actually a threat and what isn't. But I think we'd be wrong to think it's irrelevant. And I actually think some of the elements of, especially rap music, that might seem most unpolitical or non-political are actually really important, because I think one thing, like I said, we have this long tradition of protest music of various kinds. One sort of wing coming out of the organized left, the sort of socialist left, are groups like Group Yorum, who perform protest music and have been censored and thrown in jail and all this kind of stuff. And I really respect what groups like that have done and the sacrifices they've made. But I think in our moment, that kind of older tradition of explicitly left-wing music, as important as it is, can't really go viral and spread in the same way. It has a sort of core base of supporters, many of who are organized in parties. But I think something like rap, precisely because it incorporates elements of pleasure, enjoyment, a lot of this music was designed for parties and still kind of has that element of pleasure and merriment. I think that's really crucial for any sort of oppositional voice to, quite frankly, also be fun. And I think that's one thing that rap kind of offers, and one thing is why I think it spread so quickly.
Absolutely.
So I'll stop there. There's more to say.
No, I think this is fantastic. I think the emotion that it evokes is very much why we see it spread so quickly. That again, it's speaking to these universal issues that people are really connecting to, and the emotion, whether it's joy or rage or grief or frustration or whatever it is, I think comes through very clearly in that kind of platform.
I want to remind everyone of a particular sentence Erdogan has kept repeating. And I have it in Turkish here. I've put it in my notes. Her yerde hakimiyeti kurduk, kültürde kuramadık. He has repeated this several times. To translate, it means we have established hegemony everywhere, but not in culture. Yep. So there is, in the examples that have come up, a sort of what I would call a subaltern sphere of young people, young artists, which are fragmented. Each is fragmented. Rap milieu is, with its artists, with its audiences, is one niche in this subaltern sphere. There are other such niches, obviously. I studied one such niche, humor, in satire, in the 1990s and early 2000s. That sphere has what I would call died. Because there's a criminal, in the criminal code, there's a particular item which says it's criminal to insult the president. And and there have been something, by various estimates, there are already something like 10,000 court cases of insulting the president. In the satire press, such court cases have meant fines, and the satire press is very flimsy in terms of its economic base. So they have simply been bankrupt. So the satire press, which was very political in its own genre and very popular among young people in Istanbul, has simply died.
Fined or jailed. Musa Karts was one of the Cumhuriyet
but what's happening recently is that the government does not close down particular initiatives any longer, as it did immediately in the 2 years after, in the aftermath of 1916, but targets individuals. So you don't find a place like Hafıza Merkezi being closed down, but there's this constant fear of certain people being singled out to be taken to court. But to continue, there is always a new, in the subaltern, what I call, there's always a new trend coming up. And I think the most exciting trend in Istanbul at the moment is alternative theaters. I myself am trying to follow these theaters. There are a host of names that are familiar to everyone in Istanbul these days. Kumbaracı 50, and I have actually jotted down at least 10 such initiatives. These do not have their own sahne, their own places often of performance. They are composed of people who work in the daytime and stage plays over the weekend and so on. They're always young, but always very critical. So it's a scene to follow. It's a scene that's usually invisible, even in the media. The fear is that Erdogan will discover it at some point. and sort of jump on it. But the point about subaltern spheres is that in a city such as Istanbul, where there are 1.5 million university students alone, there's this constant, vibrant energy to express through various spheres. The point is that these are fragmented. And they are physically dispersed. So the idea of their adding up, as in the case of Gezi, to a movement of sorts, may be utopian.
I love this idea of subaltern spheres, whether it's in music or whether it's in theater. And my take is that we won't know a revolution will happen until it happens, but when it happens, it's because these sort of pockets of resistance and pockets of art and pockets of people sharing their frustrations through creative ways have been formed as kind of like latent energy, and maybe they can be harnessed. So I think being able to see the potential through the theater window as you've given us, and music and film, I think is hopefully should give some of us hope in terms of what is possible, that change is possible, and it doesn't just have to be regime change, but societal change. So I want to see if there are questions from the audience. I'm sure there are lots. Yes, I knew it. I love it. Excellent. Okay, so do we have microphones? We do. All right, can you go to the woman back here, please? Thank you very much. We have about half an hour.
Okay. Hello, everyone here. My name is New Phương, and I'm from Bay Atlantic University. So today I have a question for you guys here, because a few weeks ago I have just created my own channel with my own video, and on the way to school, my school is right next to the White House, and then I saw a protest, and then after that, I met a Gonun. She is my teacher. So she's telling me about this conference and tell me about this gentleman, the rapper right here, and he inspired me a lot. And today I decided that even now another presentation is waiting for me, but I still wait until now to ask him. So how can you inspire what kind of inspiration that can inspire you to like change other minds of people? And I really want that you ever you want to change another kind of artist generation as in the politics of kind of dictatorship as in your country? Because I'm from Vietnam, we are like have a very strict government, and they suppress all the protests in my country. And I found that the only way I can change the government mind and decision and policies, as well as other people awareness, just through social media. That's why I decided to create my own channel. And now I'm asking you, how can you inspire and change the politics policy? And maybe just send a small message. That's it.
Okay. Can you speak about your inspiration and how that can travel a little bit?
Well, the AKP is running the government for so long, from my early teen years. So that's the only way of running the government that I see. But because of the internet and because of the art, because of movies, I can see that there is another way to live all around the world. So that touched me so much, and that's what moved me to make my music. From time to time, I really never thought that I and my kind of music can really change something, especially in political ways, like in country like ours, yours and mine. But that's what we can do. As an artist, that's all I can do. So I feel an obligation to do it. That's all I can make, so I'm making that. And sometimes, from time to time, I'm becoming more pessimistic, and I'm saying that's all. I'm writing this just to satisfying myself, not to change anything. But every time I feel that, after in a few years, something came up. Like Susama, it was a really surprise for us to blow up and make a real fuzz, you know? For like Gezi, when I was depressed, I was writing for years at then too. But I was really pessimistic at that time, and then Gezi blew up. Every now and then something happens and renews my courage to go on. And that's all I can do. All I can do is write. I don't know what to say to you, but I'm really happy for you to start a channel and promote your ideas.
Excellent. Next question? Yep, here in the front, please. Amash?
Thank you for this great panel. It's really great that we can talk about these things in Washington. I'm Ömer Taşpınar with Brookings and NDU. My question is to Sarp. Sarp, I get the sense that we have a mega narrative of Turkey as a very polarized country. And although this may be true, my sense is also that we have another problem in Turkey, especially among liberal, middle class, educated segments of society. And that problem is being bored, desensitized, and a kind of jadedness and a fatigue. And this translates into a kind of apathy to what's going on.
Yeah.
My sense about why people watch so many dizzies in Turkey, this kind of, how do you translate that? Soap operas, is that it kind of takes up the boredom. I mean, they're just watching it and they're not involved in politics. So what you did is a very interesting thing because in a way you had a huge impact on a segment of the youth probably that is desensitized, that is not really politicized, but they're also probably thirsty for expression. They want to express something.
Yeah.
So I want to pinpoint the question to how can this turn into a larger impact, the question of mobilization of society. And Lizel, you mentioned that revolutions happen when you least expect them. And it's really about heightened expectations. And people probably in Turkey now have a kind of new expectation for things to happen. But my question is, you mentioned that you will be working with Sezen Aksu, for instance. Do you think what you did at the rap level can gain traction if you were to enlarge it to pop music and to have basically people, artists like Sezen Aksu, but also comedians in Turkey who probably have larger traction, like Cem Yılmaz, for instance? Would he somehow pick up what you're doing and turn this into a kind of sanitized, safe way of mobilizing people for something that is not overtly political, that has very strong global undertones, but that can also address the kind of big lack of freedom in Turkey that is actually fueling all these things?
So I guess two major questions there. One about the apathy and how can we counter that? And you have this fantastic scene where you're actually talking to someone and saying, you know, you with your coffee and your startup and, you know, you've been raised apolitical and no, it's your fault, it's your generation's fault. So I see there's this confrontation with the apathy that I think is really important. And then how can you kind of maybe connect with others and spread that message?
Well, I want to first talk about the comedians, stand-up comedians in Turkey. After Netflix arrived to Turkey, we started watching American stand-ups, and they're all political. It was so shocking to me because I didn't know any of them. I only knew George Carlin back then, and I thought he was an activist, not a comedian. But then I saw that every comedian is making political addressings. And in Turkey, our stand-up comics are not doing this, so it's very sad for me. And you said, what do you think, can it spread to other genres like pop music or comedy? I don't think so, actually, because now rap music is getting some kind of a mainstream music right now, but after it becomes pop, it will divide to two, like all the genres. One is full mainstream, talking nothing really serious, and the other, we call it özgün müzik, independent music. The other side of the genre, which I will be standing in, because like in folk music, there are two major sides, right? There's one in mainstream and there's one özgün müzik. The rap will be the same, I think. And I'm not very optimistic about the apathy too, actually. And like you said, I want to address something if I have 1 or 2 minutes. Like you said, the polarization is really much in our country. We wanted to make a song to unify everyone and talk about the problems that affect all of us. But when the song blew up, we saw that almost every left-wing minded person sharing it and saying that this is our guys. This is what we think and this is who they are. And also, almost all the right-wing minded people shared the song and said they are traitors and they're all lying. That was quite the opposite of the thing that we would expect to happen. And now I feel like our song somehow unintentionally served the polarization to more polarize the country, which is really bad. So I'm not really optimistic about it.
Yeah, I think it exposed some of the divides, and even those who were saying, oh, this is becoming too political, and so I have to stay away from it, even though part of it was like we have to be political, right? So
the youth, which has an apathy for the important issues, as my generation, I can say that the classical terms and classical definition of politics and economics are not suitable for us, and we don't feel like they're enough to define us. This wing, that wing, communism, socialism, liberalism, and capitalism, we don't feel that we belong in one of these definitions. That's why we are kind of leaving it to the big people to do it, more elder generations to do it, and we don't come very close to politics in that side, because we don't feel like we're really presented in that way. You know what I mean? I think that's the main problem, the language and so on. You know what I mean, I think. Yeah, we shouldn't, yeah, I agree.
No, I think this is an important point. Also, the focus on youth and the generation that Aisha Hoja was talking about, and how they have this spirit of resilience. And we've seen this over generations, right? And do you want to comment a little bit on that? Please, sure.
Something to that. Now, I don't agree about youth being apathetic. From the students and from the young people I meet, they are concerned, but not with politics in the conventional sense of the term. They're not concerned with political parties. They are in fact think all political parties are pretty trashy, without actually. But this is the same in Europe, actually. Young people have become disenchanted with regular politics, but everyone I know is engaged in some sort of activism or other. For instance, the eco movement is very much alive in Turkey. As you know, the big movement to save the Kaz Dağları, which was to some extent. And so these are local movements, and the ecology movement brings together a very diverse groups of people and mobilizes them, actually, not just youth. Others are concerned with veganism, animal rights. So everyone, I think, among youth, has one passion or another, not in what we conventionally, as I would conventionally. So they would not be interested in party politics at all.
So then the challenge is for parties, can they harness that somehow? How can they appeal? But you're absolutely right in terms of sort of these horizontal, sometimes called leaderless, sometimes called leaderful movements, where there's actually an anti-establishment ethos to them, whereby the youth who are participating in anti-globalization movements or anti-austerity movements are saying, we don't want parties to represent us, so how can we convey our voices? So I think this is really a challenge. Other questions that we have? Yes, let's go to the gentleman right back there. Thank you, sir. Introduce yourself and quick question, please. We're going to take a couple questions and then go to the panel as we wrap up.
Thank you very much. My name is Nadek Seferi, and I'm a PhD student in town. I was wondering about minority voices in the arts in Turkey. You mentioned names like Kardeş Türküler, and the example that comes to my mind is the popularity of Hemşin music in the recent past. And I was wondering whether these were sporadic episodes or if they have somehow made a mainstream dent, and perhaps even in the world of politics and policy. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. And then the woman who's right in front of you, right there.
Thank you. This is really illuminating. I did my doctoral dissertation a number of years ago looking at community arts councils in the United States. And I'm wondering if there's anything like that in Turkey, in particular neighborhoods, in a city, a large city, a small city. People get together. They have local events where they may be highlighting they were putting on plays, or they may be having small arts festivals. This is not necessarily radical or alternative at all, but it is an opportunity for people to come together, to start talking about conditions in the community, and maybe some thoughts of change can percolate. This is very much grassroots, but this kind of very direct art mobilization, I think, could lead somewhere. I wonder if there are any examples in Turkey.
Okay. Let's see if we can get a couple questions from over on this side. If you could take the woman in the middle there, please. Perfect. Thank you. Whichever way works best.
Thank you very much. My name is Heba El Shazli. I'm a professor at George Mason, political science. But my first day of class, I always show my students rap and hip hop music from the Middle East. So I was wondering, any possibilities of collaboration or relationships in terms of talking to each other between Turkish artists like yourself with Arabic-speaking artists who are also objecting and also, I mean, I think of Offendim, I think of Mashroua Leila, Wist al-Balad. I'm originally from Egypt, so, you know, you have a lot to talk about, okay? The regime in Egypt actually uses music and songs to their benefit. They've actually commissioned things during the vote and this and that. So it's very powerful. And by the way, we love Turkish soap operas. They've been, they've been translated into Arabic. You know, there are women who have divorced their husbands because of Mohammed. You know, this was several years ago. Because
and there's a documentary called Kısmet that's available on YouTube that you can watch.
Yeah, exactly.
Takes a pretty
so
optimistic
anyway,
view
so
of it,
you know, could we build on that? Since you know, so thank you.
Okay, and then how about one more? The lady in the back right there. Yeah. Sorry, we're making you work for it today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So my question actually builds a little bit on that one, which is that we seem to take Erdogan at his word that they have not established or are not trying to establish any sort of cultural hegemony. But we can actually see since Gezi that there's been a real shift in the administration of Turkish culture, with the AKP trying to take more of the sort of cultural pie, particularly in literature and I think within the dizi. And so I was wondering if in the arts world, in the sort of museum sense, but also in music, if we have seen sort of the AKP attempt to establish sort of power, cultural power, or to get cultural power through those initiatives.
Okay, so I'm going to give each of you about a minute or 2 minutes to answer whichever of those questions that you want, because we need to wrap up. I know we started a little late. So we've got minority voices, we've got local cultural initiatives, we've got cross-country collaboration potentially, and then AKP roles. So Aisha Hoca, can I start with you, and we'll ask you to be really brief with your comments.
I accepted to come here mainly to divorce myself from the increasingly dystopian vision I have in Turkey. Turkey maybe seems better from Washington. It doesn't really. But and so I've avoided issues of direct censorship, which are massive. Individuals being targeted. So the art field is full of individual censorship and censorship. This is also true of minority music as well. most censored, strongly censored, are the Kurdish initiatives. All independent Kurdish initiatives in southeastern Turkey have literally been closed down by government decree. So that is very strong. Less strong is the Armenian one, although we talked about this, some of the activities of Hrant Dink Foundation have been censored. So censorship is a very important issue, and I don't want to minimize it. Also, the government has been establishing what are called troll organizations. Troll organizations I'm translating this from Turkish, but for instance, the Erdogan's daughter has a foundation which publishes a journal called Kadem, and Kadem is really an intellectual enterprise of countering gender mainstreaming and substituting family mainstreaming. So it's become important, and the term gender has been abolished from courses in universities. So instead of gender mainstreaming, there's this emphasis on family mainstreaming. So we're going to introduce family courses, I suppose, in universities. I don't know. What I'm more hopeful about is the vibrancy of grassroots, frankly, and the difficulty of imposing on the grassroots in areas that are not so. I would wish that as each wave of censorship comes, something new and counter and new ways of avoiding it will also come up.
Okay. Kenan, can we turn to you for your thoughts?
Quickly. So quickly. With the question about minority music, I think things are happening, but they're rather scattered. Yeah. And when they get support, it's often from a kind of world music industrial complex, if we can call it that. But there are interesting things. I think the people who have fared best are the Laz people. Of course, when Kazım Koyuncu was alive, he was doing lots of stuff, and I think generally stuff in Lazuri is seen as non-threatening. Of course, the most important thing with this, because it's the biggest minority, is of course the Kurds. And like we talked about, it's been really difficult for sort of music. It's a bit different now, but still a challenge. One person I didn't mention in my sort of lineage of important political musicians was, of course, Ahmet Kaya, who left the country after almost basically being attacked for wanting to produce an album in Turkish, and then died young in exile. And I think as this kind of larger point, we've been talking, an interesting sort of thread has come up around fragmentation, both in terms of genres doing interesting stuff, but separated, also in terms of different groups and coalitions. I mean, an interesting thing about Susamam was bringing all these separate issues together into a single thing. But one thing that I think is really difficult right now, because of the really toxic political environment, about talking about even saying the K word sometimes and talking about Kurds, is that with all this interesting bubbling up of music, it hasn't really been visible. So I don't blame any musicians for this, like we heard in the first panel. It's very hard to have a position on this because people feel kind of alone and could be trapped. But I think one thing that really I found striking, both with Susamam and Olay as Hal's video, is that in the midst of talking about all these different issues in the case of Susamam, or showing clips of all these recent events that have been traumatic, one of probably the most major issue in Turkey the last several years, the last decades, but particularly the last few years, with the renewal of the conflict, is of course the issue with Kurds. And it's almost hard to imagine, with the threats people already faced for the stuff they made, as Hel, for example, putting a clip when he showed all these other things happening, also, Tahir Elçi getting assassinated, or Roboski, or different events like that. It's almost unsayable. But I think, as with Gezi, one weakness, and I think the critique of the White Turk is a really important one, that Sarp does in the video, is how these things can link up and support a kind of democratic and nonviolent thing, but the threat of even bringing it up into the music when already the stakes are so high, I understand why people don't. I think it's really difficult, but it's the crucial issue, perhaps.
Okay, I'm going to give you the last word, Sarp.
Well, I'd like to answer the question of the professor, which says that we should make more music with the other Middle Eastern rappers. Before Susamam, I was never, I never dreamed of coming here and talking about my country's issues. But after Susamam, I realized that music cannot change the world, but we can make our voices heard. So after Susamam, it's a great idea to we all poor Middle Eastern borners should come together, divide and make music together. It's a great thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. Thank you for all your contributions. Lütfen hiç susmayacağız. Thank you very much.